Helena Metaferia and Lisa Anderson. This is a part of our Frieze programming. We're exhibiting Helena's latest work at Frieze London this year. And we're really excited. We got this collaboration between the BCA and Helena. This is our first time exhibiting a solo presentation in London. So we thought it would be a great opportunity to connect Helena with Lisa Anderson, who does some really, really wonderful work, especially at the BCA, which is the kind of leading cultural archives in the UK for Black history. So two works in our booth at Frieze London are made using material from the Black Cultural Archives in Brixton. So yeah, we were really excited to have this in conversation where they'll be discussing the importance of archives, especially Black cultural archives. So I'll just introduce Helena Metaferia, who's a multidisciplinary artist based in New York. Helena is of Ethiopian American descent. She works across collage, assemblage, video, sculpture, and I'm delighted to introduce Lisa Anderson, who's the managing director of the Black Cultural Archives in Brixton. She's also a freelance curator and also the founder of Black British Art. So yeah, I'm really excited to hear them talk and discuss the process of the collaboration and the importance of utilizing archives in different and new, innovative, creative ways. So I will pass on the mic to Lisa.
Thank you, Helena. It's such an honor and a joy to be in conversation with you, Helena, given the way in which you have beautifully activated our archives from the Black Cultural Archives. I think it was around June last year that I received an email from McKenna saying, look, we have this phenomenal artist who's really keen to explore your archives in pursuit of creating new works. And I thought, this is perfect. For those folks who don't know about Black Cultural Archives, yes, you got it right, we are the home of Black British history. But I think of our archives as a treasure trove of information that, when activated, when engaged with, when researched, can produce new knowledge and new culture that can inspire and empower. And that's really at the heart of its purpose for existing. Obviously, there's a way for that to be achieved through education, but you know, we wouldn't have an archive of so much amazing information if it wasn't for the creative and innovative skills of artists. So the fact that you wanted to engage with our work is really key. So I want to start with this first question, which I think is just a useful route into this conversation, which is why research is so important to you as an artist and as part of your artistic practice.
Thank you, Lisa, for these questions and being in conversation with me. Thank you to Addis Fine Art, to the whole team, Raku, Aline, Kenna, Kate. Really, it's so wonderful to be able to present during Frieze and to be in London and to engage with these archives. So the project has been really an unfolding for me. I'm an artist, like most artists, who work with a sense of curiosity. And that curiosity leads me in many different directions and many different mediums, all to tell narratives and to tell stories about what I think is to be true about the human condition. And it's very complex, right? Like, humanity is so complex and so multi-layered, and my collages and my tapestries are so complex and so multi-layered. But there's color there, there's a sense of unification there. So I'm really interested in this idea of organizing as an artistic act, as a political act, as an academic and researcher act, organizing of information, of bodies, of materials. And that is a through line in my practice, and it may manifest in different ways. It may come forward as organizing people for a socially engaged experience or as a workshop. It may come in the form of organizing bits of pieces of material, silkscreen fabric, into an elaborate tapestry, such as what's behind me. But the curiosity is what drives the work. And as a visitor to London, as a non-British resident or artist, I could only come with that and a sense of collaboration. And working with the archives at BCA, it was a collaborative project. It was the help of the librarians and the research assistant, Blue, who's a local activist. So, yeah.
So just to give people a bit of an insight into your experience of visiting the archives, we have a world of information, and within that world of information are some really exciting collections of information around activist histories. And I know activist histories in particular are very key to your work. How did you go about identifying the collections that would speak to your intentions for this project, which has led to the creation of these wonderful works? Just so people can know if they're inspired and intrigued about pursuing their own research work to activate their artistic visions.
So I am oftentimes lending my platform to issues of change, social change, artistic change, political change. And I'm thinking about that through the lens of somebody who identifies as a diasporic person, as a Black person, as a person who's embodied as a woman identifying person. And so I find myself oftentimes in solidarity with movements around the world that are often fighting for against oppression, against marginalized people. And so as I come in as a researcher, I don't profess to know what I'm going to find. That's the whole point of the journey of research. But I am looking to see what has come before me, particularly generations that have come before me. A lot of the archives were dated in 1980, and I won't say the date, the year I was born. And it was something that I was curious at. It was like, you know, how did I come into this world, and what was happening here, and how does that look like, or how did that feel different than where I was born in Washington, D.C., and where my family was born in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And so I'm connecting all of these dots, kind of. And in the work, there is a lot of connectivity that you'll see that I'm expressing through fiber arts, through textile, through weaving. I'm trying to find points of reference that for one to find themselves, but points to get lost in, because oftentimes the archive, as we know, is incomplete, right? They've come through donation, they've come through various forms into existence, and it's a place to kind of reconcile with the fact that we will never know everything.
So what did you discover at Black Cultural Archives in terms of the particular collections? It's worthwhile highlighting for the audience that one of our most popular collections is information about the Black women's movement, which was particularly rife in the 1980s. And it was really wonderful to see that that had influenced some of your research. So it would be nice if you could just share a bit about the particular materials that found their way into your consideration for this work.
I don't know if I'm holding this correctly, by the way. Am I supposed to be pressing something, or? Oh, okay. just a mic check. Oh, I'm supposed to press it. I have not been pressing it. Okay, now I know to press the button. So what I have found, what I discovered is what was maybe not so surprising, but beautiful to know, was that there was an era of like Black feminist thought. There was some intersectional feminism happening, particularly documenting in the 80s and the 70s here in the UK. Stella Dazzi is a very prolific Black liberationist who was co-authoring the book, The Heart of Race, and that was very fascinating to me, and just reading through some of that material. The Outright newspaper was another archive that I drew a lot from, which focused on international women's issues, intersectional women's issues. And to me, it did mirror other movements that I've seen. I was also really fascinated with the Brixton uprisings and ways in which carnival as a tradition was actually a revolutionary sort of gathering that happened, which I didn't know about. So those were some specifics, but I was also not surprised, but I was intrigued by the ways that U.S. activism informed Black movements here. And as you know from my research, I'm also looking at the ways Ethiopian anti-imperialism movements have infected throughout the movements throughout the diaspora. So there was those threads being connected before my eyes. Marcus Garvey was a major figure that was celebrated in a lot of the newspapers, of course, Bob Marley. And so the ways in which arts, culture, philosophy, literature, politics all kind of wove together. And just some of the photographs are just really beautiful. If anyone has the time to go to BCA and look through, I mean, these are all in the public domain, right? Like these are, I'm only working with things that are accessible to all of us because I'm starting a conversation, hopefully. I'm continuing a conversation that's been happening at BCA, and then others can pick that up and do what they want with that. And that to me is really important. There's always a complete bibliography with each of my works. And I make that, it's painstaking to do, to go back after you're like in the studio just thinking about formal aesthetics and to make a document that points to the authors and the photographers that I'm citing and as much information as actually that I can actually include. But to me, it's really important from a scholarship perspective, but also because, you know, I am working with appropriation and I am doing that in honor of those who've labored before. And so to discredit that or to not acknowledge that, you know, that those things exist and that there's work that we can draw upon that others have left for us, I think would be a disservice to the work. So it is something that I really pride myself to take the care to do. But yeah, I mean, it was a fun project, and I'm so grateful to have made a few for Frieze, and I hope to continue to make more in this series. And I'm honored that I get to work with local activists to produce the work too. So it wasn't just me in the archive. I was able to work with somebody who's rooted here and who was more committed. Blue, who's a very talented artist activist, and I feel like that is also a part of the collaboration aspect, but also part of my pedagogy as a professor too, as a way of thinking about many generations that can come together to tell this story and to rebirth and to help think about the story we want to leave for the future, right? Because I'm also building an archive here, but I'm also thinking about what's happening in our moment just as much as I'm thinking about what's happened in decades prior. And when these things get activated through performance, these tapestries are all worn in performance art. When they get discussed about in this way, we can't help but think about what's happening in the here and now.
Wow, that was so rich. There were so many ideas that were popping up in my mind as you were saying that. I want to thank you for pointing out the interconnection between activism in the States and the UK. I think it's a connection that often gets overlooked. Many of us Black British cultural workers, historians, I think we've got a bit of a bugbear about the fact that our activist history often gets conflated with American history. It is Black Cultural Archive's mission to make sure that civil rights activism over here is better well understood, but at the same time there's a huge opportunity to talk about the interconnections. For example, Black Cultural Archives wouldn't exist if it wasn't for necessarily, but maybe I should say it a different way, a huge inspiration for the actual culmination of the Black Cultural Archives as a project that is based in its own building, that is a home for Black history and culture, was inspired by Queen Mother Moore, who you would know is a really well-respected elder, and well, she's now passed away, but an amazing activist who was very much in contact with Marcus Garvey. So we're actually, if you think about the genealogy of those connections, we're fulfilling that kind of transatlantic connection of celebrating and advocating for the importance of our history. Slight turn of conversation. You've alluded now, I want to get people to really get a sense of how you went about creating these beautiful tapestries and your process around that. So how you translate the research aspect into thinking about how you make that material. You talked a little bit about the interweaving of ideas, the connections, but you know, I think many of the people who are listening will be very intrigued to understand how you selected those images, how you sit with them, how you lay them out. Can you tell us a bit about the process, the silk screening process, and then the weaving and the color scape that you choose for each particular work as well?
So I love being in my head and doing all this heady cerebral stuff with archives, but then I love being in my body just as much. And for me, play is the best conduit for any artist. It's a starting point that most of us have had as children, that creativity of being able to just run amok with coloring, pencil or crayon or, I mean, that is actually something that I still feel very keen to. So for me, I have to play with the material in this very tactile way. So once I have this sort of digital archive of after the archives have been scanned and the librarians help to scan the archives at PA, and then I work with my research assistants to sort of organize that material and to silk screen them onto fabric. And I spend a lot of time, like a kid in a candy store, at both the art supply store and the fabric store, because for me, it's all about the texture. It's all about the material that these things will live on. Finding a gauze that looks like Ethiopian fabric for me just gives a very nostalgic sort of feeling. And so I'm thinking carefully about what looks like newspaper, but what also can be cloth. Because again, these tapestries get worn in performances. I have a performance called The Willing, in which I wear tapestries and crowns and celebrate my body, the bodies of other women in the audience and collaborators. And so we do these adornings. So I'm thinking about what would also be practical in that sense. And then everything gets laid out in my studio on the floor, and it becomes an aesthetic choice after that. Composition comes to me, color comes to me. I've been working with the tapestries for about 1.5 years and almost 2 years, and they have been under a restricted color palette that keeps growing a little bit with some nuance. These, like the tapestry behind me, is all U.S. archives from Nashville, from the National Public Library. I did a project in Nashville, and so these are some archives that came from that. And then I'm working with the red, white, and blue for very obvious, national sort of content. But then these purples started to work for me, like the red and the, when we think about the red as, thinking about more of the conservative parties, having red as their primary color, and then blue for the Democratic parties. And then I started to look at this as almost like an election map behind me. And if anyone's seen the election maps that happen, there's the reds and the blue states kind of fighting. And this is kind of like Florida over here, kind of like having this moment of trying to reconcile what it wants to be. But then the purple, when I started to lay the sheer fabric over, like red over blue, I started to see the purple. And I was like, oh, that's the shades of gray that I'm quite interested in. That's the nuance that I'm looking for. I'm not looking for what's so obvious. I'm looking for what happens when we squint and we see something new. And so then purple started to come into the work more. But it started with just black and white, grays, and like a tiny bit of red. And each piece gets more and more intense. And then the one behind you, Lisa, is like this other smaller experimentation, thinking about what happens when it stretches and it starts to feel like more like a painting tradition. And I'm very inspired by both contemporary painting, as I've been trained in the West, but also Ethiopian talisman traditions. And so oftentimes my work is inspired by the hand jobs of the talisman scrolls. And so I'm looking at color and form and shape and patterns and just little motifs that can signify everything from, kind of printmaking aesthetic or Rauschenberg or that sort of like Western canon to like shamanic traditions in Ethiopia, right? So, and then this one's called Free Hui, and I'm looking at archives of Black Panther resistance movements found from Brown University libraries where I teach. And then making these sort of juxtapositions that complicates it. But yeah, color, shape, form. I mean, I'm an artist, so these are our building blocks, and that's what I'm actually interested when I make. Everything else is a cerebral activity that happens before, with the research, with the material finding. But after that, it's really like, where's the play?
In the tapestry created using BCA imagery and text, there's a lot of patches of black. I have an inkling as to what that signifies, but it would be really lovely for you to kind of talk about that a little bit more. And also the way in which you've incorporated, you know, the hand stitching approaches, and there's X's over some images. And just want to know whether there's any symbolic relevance. I'm sure there is, just to give us an insight into that.
So with the text, I'm often also referencing African American quilting traditions, which are a hand sort of stitching process of storytelling. Often storytelling happens with the quilting, and it is a ways to bring disparate material and people together in this very unified way. So again, I'm looking at organizing people in these archives of protest specifically. I'm looking at organizing information. And then the other part of your question was? Oh, the patches of black. So the black, for me, is what we don't know, what we can't find, what's not in the archive, what's omitted, what biases the archive may have. Who are the people that are unnamed, undertold, that are making moves every day to ensure that we have equity and freedom and justice moving forward and in the past. The archive is often incomplete, and often women's labor isn't as documented, even though they heavily contribute to social justice movements. For example, it was understood that the Black Panther Party was 60% women, but most of the relics of the newspapers did not highlight women's activities. So I'm thinking about all of those nuances, the omission of other people who are either marginalized or of the majority who are contributing in some kind of way. And so, yeah, that's kind of the aesthetic that I've chosen to represent that.
It's such a treat to be up close, surrounded by them, so please do take advantage to come and visit the works whilst they're still available to see at Frieze. And I do hope that there'll be other ways for the audience at Black Cultural Archives to engage with the work. I mean, there's just so much programmatic possibility in conversation with the community around what these works represent, and to inspire other artists and historians as well. But I would be doing an injustice if I didn't talk about the other stunning piece of work that you created in relation to the research you did, which is this beautiful crown called Tetu, which features, I think, representation of women, activists, at the very base of the crown, right across and around it. It's a really beautiful, stunning piece of work that, for me, obviously it brings into mind just the regality of leadership, but juxtaposed with those kind of struggles of liberation is a very empowering and kind of poignant statement. Can you tell us a bit more about your practice with crowns? It's not the first crown you've made, but tell us a bit about your approach to creating this particular piece of work.
So the crown series is made out of brass and has etchings of different archives. The one we're showing at Frieze is named after Taitu, who was the Ethiopian queen who was very instrumental in supporting the revolt against imperialism in Ethiopia. And it is with archives from BCA and features prominent women activists, as well as the mass images of crowds in gathering for International Women's Day and other sort of marches that took place. And I haven't made a lot of them. I've only made a very handful because they're very intricate, and I work with a jeweler, and it's this whole, again, a collaborative process to make it feel expensive but not being pure gold. And so there's this sort of, kind of the rust and the oxidation and the patina of the work becomes a sort of making it look more like an artifact. And there's all kinds of aesthetic choices that I've had to make the work. But it also couldn't be too heavy because I actually wanted to wear the crown. So the first few were getting, the first few that we were welding were starting to look not just heavy, they were feeling very heavy. And I was like, I don't think I could actually perform in this. So there was a lot of trial and error, but I think I've got something down now. And I want to do a few more, but there won't be many. I think that there is a preciousness to them that I don't necessarily feel like I'm limiting in the collages that I make or the tapestries that I make. And the idea is that each time they are made, they fit my head, which is the one they were made for, but they can fit generally a few other heads that I place it on, and that they can be ritualized. And so that felt really important to me, that they weren't just these stagnant objects. I also spent some time in Ethiopia earlier this year looking at actual crowns in the museums and looking at how incredibly intricate they are and how regal they are. And that notion of regality, I work a lot with these headdress collages and as a recurring motif, or the crowns. These are ways that people have historically used in cultures around the world to bring pride, to bring esteem. And more than anything, I'm interested in the upliftment and the sentiment of upliftment of black women, of brown women, of people who identify as women and non-binary, to come together with a sense of that the things that are heavy on us, literally heavy on our heads, won't overtake us. That we will find ways in which we can remix or collage or change or shift that narrative so that they empower us because we have survived them. And that is the underlying sort of motif in all of my work. There's always some sort of esteem building. And that is my work as an artist, as a human, as a concerned citizen, as a professor, as everything that I do has that sort of sentiment because somebody did that for me. And that is why I'm here talking to you, and somebody has done that for you, and that is what we pass forward. So it's about passing that crown forward.
Can you say something about how key your somatic and performance practice is to realizing that potential? I got shivers thinking about you cloaking yourself, shrouding and empowering yourself by wearing these tapestries, and I'm sure something similar happens when you place the crown upon your head. I'm also really intrigued by the way in which you collaborate and bring other people into that experience through your performances. So please share a bit about how you've done that in the past and any plans to do that in the future with these new works.
So as most of my work deals with the archive, but it really starts with embodied practices, and those include performance art, which is experimental, not necessarily performing, but the more experimental version of that. And then social engagement, which has so many different names. You can say it's new genre or social practice or community work. But they're bodies in space and conversation, ultimately. And I could use my own body. I think sometimes that suffices, but sometimes it doesn't, right? Like if I'm thinking about a movement, I need more than my body. So I'll draw upon volunteers, members in the community who want to partake in my workshops and my socially engaged work. I'm interested in that from a theoretical level, but also a practical level, because none of my work is meant to be symbolic. It is, in fact, a form of activism, even if it is through art, which has all of its complications. And so when I'm social organizing, you can say that and maybe, get a grant for it or do whatever, find an institution that will back it. But really what I'm interested in doing is supporting individual movements. And I come from a line of activists in my family, and so that was something that I just sort of grew up with. And a lot of this stuff was just how I came into the world. I grew up in a very politicized city of Washington, D.C., and so going to marches and things like that was just something that was in my life. And so when it came time to create, artists are always looking for that story that has some depth and some range that lives within them. And so this is a story that predates me, that I've inherited, and that I will continue forward. Coming from a line of activists and educators, it feels very much like second skin. But it is heavy work, and I always tell people, like, I will do this work, and then at some point I'm going to do some other kind of work that has to do with pretty flowers and roses and nothing heavy, because we can only do this work for so long. I am not a martyr. So I have a very intense studio schedule, and this is a robust time of year where I'm showing, and then I will have my retreat time to rejuvenate and then come back out. And while I'm doing that work, hopefully the baton has been passed for somebody else to do that other kind of more heavy lifting, because as I said, it's generational. And so that's why I work with the young people a lot, and that's why I receive mentorship a lot wherever I can. Because it is something that it's an oral tradition, survival. as people, as an oral tradition, but it's also an archive tradition, and so that's what I'm pulling from.
A word that comes to mind, and definitely I did read in reference to your work, is healing. And you're alluding to that in the way that you balance your practice and rejuvenate. And I'm just thinking about how you might wish for Black Cultural Archives to continue on with the torch with the work that you've done now. This is a surprise question. I didn't tell you I was going to ask this, but it's just come to mind as I'm thinking, because I'm really committed to making sure that we honour the work of artists who do engage with our work, and that we use it to kind of inspire other artists as well, but bring people into communication with the power of art for healing. So,
well, the archive is living. We are the archive. We are embodied stories, all of us, with our memories and our thoughts and our hearts and our minds and our bodies. We have a story, and so the more opportunities that we have, that we can develop for people to tell their living story, to archive that. And artists, our job as professionals, as you know, this is our like duty in the world, is we help, you know, create and think about a future that hasn't yet come yet, you know, and so cultivate that energy and say, this is a potential. This is a future. This is an inspiration. This is something that we can sort of look towards. And we're creating something out of nothing. In my practice, I'm creating something out of what others have left behind. But oftentimes, I have to see that that's even a potential. I have to believe in that. And so if you can believe in us and entrust us with opportunities, inviting more artists to work with your archive, but even to just listen more to people's embodied stories. Because everyone, I believe, is a creative. Everybody has creative potential. And everyone is an archive. And so we just need to collect that information and not take that for granted, and celebrate that and celebrate us.
I think that's a perfect note to on. Really inspiring, and thank you. Do we have?
One or two questions?
Of course, yes. Let's do that.
This is for you, Lisa.
All right.
I would love to know more about how the BCA kind of came about, and also how you add to the archives. Like, what, if you are adding year on year, trying to kind of retain and preserve Black history, what is it you think about that is important, and how do you think about that? How do you think, with foresight, to preserve material?
These are such important questions. Repeat the questions. So Ikenna asked, how did Black Cultural Archives come about? And then he asked about, how do we think about selecting works for our collection to add to our collections? What do we think of in terms of priorities around that? Okay, so the first question is easy and hopefully really inspiring for me to answer. I always love saying this. The archives came about because people our age decided, in the face of their children being categorized as educationally subnormal, being ill-treated in school, having no role models to inspire them like we do now in media, not easy access to books around histories that represent their ancestry, decided we're going to do something about it. We have to. I think the Black Parents movement, 1960s and 70s, activists around racial equality more generally, and then when the uprisings happened, all these different lines of activism led to a group of people coming together and saying, you know what, we're going to create the Black Cultural Archives. The Black Cultural Archives began as collections of organizational materials, magazines, newspapers, books that were found in different places in somebody's home. And then when that home got full to the brim, it was like, we've got to find a place to put this. It's a community-based archive. people didn't have archiving qualifications to do this. It was because they wanted to steward legacy. They wanted to ensure that there was an empowered approach to stewarding knowledge and handing that over and making it accessible for inspiration and empowerment, not just for the Black community, but for society at large. A key name in that is Lane Garrison. We celebrate him as one of the leading founders of Black Cultural Archives, but there were many women obviously working alongside him who are really key, and I won't go too much about that, but please do come and ask me further questions if you want to know deeper history about Black Cultural Archives. But on that note, it's a priority for me that we do articulate and document our story in a more powerful way going forward, so people get that full breadth, that rich and complex history about how this archive came into being. So very good that you asked. How do we acquire collections? Well, we've been existing for 40 years now, so there is a listening for people who are doing important work in the community, that we are a safe space to deposit our collections. We're hoping to increasingly build people's confidence in us as a safe space where the information will be looked after well, in good settings and standards of recording, etc. But because we have collections of the likes of Stella Dadzi and all the work that she's done, we have the Runnymede collections, really important collections. I think that inspires other organizations to consider us, other activists, other artists, and everyday people. It's not just these, well-known stories. Sometimes it can be the ordinary that is extraordinary. Sometimes people don't even know that their fathers had these amazing histories of activism or had just a really interesting story, and they think when they discover boxes of letters and organizational papers, they come to us and donate. So we do have some collections guidelines. You can contact us to know the details around that. But if you think it's worthwhile us considering it, we will have a conversation with you. What we don't do is actively collect objects, but we are increasingly receiving picture documentation. We know that it's so inspiring to encounter images in the archive, so hopefully that gives you a bit of an understanding.
I had one question for Helena, which is what's the differences and the kind of, I guess, the individual characteristics of each archives that you work with? Because of course you work with so many, not only across the States, but also, I know you've worked with some in South Africa, and of course now in the UK. Can you just kind of give us a feel of, everything from the difficulty of accessing some, or the ease in which, and just, what's it like for you as an artist to encounter all of these different archives which are like I said, across the US and also some across the globe?
Challenge for me as an artist who works with archives is I'm often thinking about the digitization of them because so many have not been digitized, so many really beautiful libraries. So as I travel and as I work with different libraries and institutions, it becomes, I'm only sometimes in town for a certain amount of time, and then I have to think about working with local, either the librarians themselves. Sometimes people prefer to do their own like high-res scanning, or with local research assistants that I can employ to help support that. So it just becomes a matter of access. Also convincing sometimes people to work with their archive. The work doesn't exist unless I get the cooperation of librarians, and those who are stewards of the archives. So I have to spend a lot of time, which I don't mind at all, educating them as to my process as an artist, to talk about fair use and how things can be and are in fact legal for artists to work with collage material and as long as it's transformative. And so there's often these preliminary conversations with, I'm sure you all at These Fine Art were able to see some of that as we worked with BCA to say, hey, okay, what is it that you want and how can we do this? And and so then it gets people thinking and talking about the ways in which the arts can be used using a library. And most times in the places that I've encountered, they're not used to an artist working with the archive. They're used to working with a scholar. And so there's things I've had to learn as an artist about, like, okay, well, I can't bring in water or, certain, things around the material. Like, I've had to learn to become very delicate and wear gloves with certain materials. And I mean, these are things that might be common sense for a scholarly researcher, but there's an etiquette in the archive that I almost got kicked out of my first archive because I didn't follow all the rules. And even like when I want to use a camera, like I'm sensitive about, when I'm photographing it and certain things. But the most important thing is building those relationships, because without that, the work wouldn't exist for me.
Thank you so much. Incredibly insightful, really, really interesting conversation. Helena's work is in our booth at Frieze, at booth H33, so please come by and see it. It's on until Sunday. And yeah, thank you again for this. And also thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Blue, and thank you everyone at the BCA who made this possible. Yes, that's an important caveat. And yeah. Yes, and thank you, Helena, for letting us see your incredible work. Thank you.
Don't need to keep this on the live, but I just wanted to thank my team at AFA.